I'm Dvorah Diman, Professor Emerita from University of Haifa, Department of Israelite History and Bible. I was assigned to chair two distinguished scholars, but the first one, Professor Israel, no, הוא ברח לי. Finkelstein, of course, Israel Finkelstein will be on the Zoom, so I'll just introduce him. Well, how come that such a famous scholar just escaped me? He's an archaeologist and a professor emeritus at Tel Aviv University, where he taught most of his career. But now he's the director of the School of Archaeology at the University of Haifa, and we are very happy about it. He's famous for his groundbreaking insight into the ancient Israelite history, has conducted many field excavations in Israel and authored some 400 articles. For many years, he edited the Tel Aviv Journal, the periodical of the Tel Aviv University. He is the winner of the Dan David Award for 2005. He will read a paper on, and now I have to read, is Archaeologist Black Hole, Jerusalem and the Yehud, Judea in the Persian and early Hellenistic periods. Please.
Thank you very much. I hope that you all you can all hear me. Let me put first of all the presentation on the screen. I wish to start by extending my sincere and deepest apology for not being able to attend the conference in person. I'm very sorry about it. This is an important conference, and I wish I could have met all of you in person, but I can tell you that I follow as many lectures as I can on Zoom. So again, sorry for not being there with you, and let me start reading the paper. So I suppose that I was invited to speak in this esteemed conference to represent archaeology, the archaeology of the Persian period in Jerusalem in particular, and Yehud in general. After all, archaeology, together with biblical exegesis and ancient Near Eastern records, is a major pillar in reconstructing the history of ancient Israel, including its religious history and cult. As far as I know, Yahwism under the Achaemenid Empire can be studied first and foremost from biblical texts, which biblical researchers date to the Persian period. With no extra biblical testimony, this may lead to circular arguments. Indeed, a tendency developed in recent years in biblical research to ascribe a large number of compositions to the Persian period. The question is, where were these texts written? If scholars point to Jerusalem, to differ from Babylonia and Egypt, and more about this later, the archaeology of Jerusalem in particular and Yehud in general must be consulted. This includes both settlement history and material culture, and in the latter, mainly scribal activity. What I'm about to say is not new. I have written about this before, and hence my paper today is basically a summary, but with updates which stem from recent excavations. So we are totally updated here. Let me start by saying that as I page through scholarly assumptions regarding biblical texts in the Persian period, I am struck by a strong sense of déjà vu. I'm reminded of past discussions of the period of the patriarchs and more related to my own work, the reconstruction of a united monarchy. I refer to conventional wisdom that was based on conceptual structure with little hardcore data behind it or evidence. in both archaeology played an important role in bringing the structure down. So let me start with Jerusalem and with past research. Scholars have usually referred to Persian period Jerusalem as a significant fortified town with a relatively large population. This observation was based on uncritical reading of the biblical text, first and foremost the book of Nehemiah. Uncritical in the sense that the dating of the text is far from being firmly established and that archaeology has not been properly consulted. Let me give a few examples from the last 20 to 15 years. Ephraim Stern, an archaeologist, began the discussion of the archaeology of Jerusalem in the Persian period with the following sentence, and I quote, "Persian period Jerusalem was bounded by walls erected by Nehemiah." Diana Edelman, my friend for many years, accepted the Nehemiah 3 as accurately reflecting, and I quote again, the names of individuals and settlements in Yehud at the time of the walls of Jerusalem were constructed during the reign of Artaxerxes I. David Yosishkin, another friend, presented a critical approach but accepted that the Persian period settlement was fortified. And Oded Lipschitz, another very close friend, argued that a change in the history of Jerusalem occurred in the middle of the 5th century BC, and I quote, when the fortifications of Jerusalem were rebuilt, unquote. So these quotes lead me to the finds. Intensive archaeological research in Jerusalem in the past 40 years has shown that the stunning old city was not inhabited in the Persian period. Persian period pottery found in several places there originated mostly from fields that could have been brought from other places, of course. The Persian period settlement should therefore be sought on the southeastern ridge, called the City of David, in quote and unquote. Here and below, I'm using this term, City of David, only in its modern geographical sense. So, in the City of David and or the Temple Mount, and I'll get to this point in a minute. In the City of David, most finds from the Persian period, also early Hellenistic, were retrieved from the eastern slope of the central part of the ridge in the vicinity of the Gihon Spring. In Shiloh's excavations, Persian period finds, stratum 9, were meager and poor. Most of them originated from fields and quarry refuse. Persian period sherds and some seal impressions were found by Reich and Shukrun about 200-250 meters south of the Gihon Spring. I mean, from the Gihon down to the south about 250 meters. The early Hellenistic period, stratum 8, is also represented by meager finds in the same sector of the ridge. Recent excavations in the Givati parking lot, located northwestern sector of the City of David ridge, revealed strong activity in the Iron II Sea and in the late Hellenistic period. Finds of the latter period support the notion that the remains excavated by Crowfoot in the Western Gatehouse, so-called, immediately to the south, indeed date to the late Hellenistic or early Roman period, as proposed by David Yosishkin. If the late Hellenistic fortification uncovered here indeed belongs to the Akra, as suggested by the excavators, the first wall, which is later than this fortification, cannot date before the late 2nd century BC. The latest excavation in this area revealed evidence for limited activity of early Persian period's quarters in the ruins of an elaborate Iron II Sea building. And you can see this on the screen now. And also remains dating to the first half of the 2nd century, that is to say to the Seleucid period. This strengthens the observation that even in the central part of the City of David ridge, activity between 586 and around 200 BC was limited at best. No Persian or early Hellenistic finds were uncovered in the southern part of the ridge. In this sector of the site, late Hellenistic or early Roman remains are found directly on top of the Iron II layer, which in pattern rests on bedrock. As for the northern part of the ridge, the Persian and early Hellenistic period were not represented in Benjamin and Eilat Mazar's excavations to the south of the southern wall of the Temple Mount, which yielded late Hellenistic and mainly early Roman finds superimposed over Iron II buildings. The same is true for Eilat Mazar's recent excavations slightly to the east. To summarize this point, the only parts of the city of David Ridge which yielded Persian and early Hellenistic finds is the area above the Gihon spring and the slope slightly to the south of the spring. But even in this sector, a century of excavations failed to yield a single house or proper floor from the Persian period. Only one structure from the early Hellenistic period was found. The pottery and seal impressions seem to have derived from fields and mixed debris. Most of these finds may have originated from debris brought to the city of David Ridge from elsewhere. The idea that the settlement was eradicated because of later activity and erosion must be rejected in the light of the reasonable preservation of Iron II and late Hellenistic remains. You have to tell me that you can hear me because I'm not sure. Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Please tell me that you can hear me. Okay, I can see now. Fine, thank you very much. I was a little bit hesitant about this. So let's go back to the presentation. Okay. And I can see from Oded, who sends me a WhatsApp message, that you can hear me. So this is very good. Thank you, Oded. So so let's proceed. And when we proceed, we get to my friend Oded as well, together with me. So where did the meager Persian and early Hellenistic finds, a scatter of pottery and seal impressions collected in the city of David Ridge, originate from? Following an idea first raised by Knauf, a few years ago, Ido Koch, Oded Lipschitz, and I suggested that the Mount of Jerusalem was located on the Temple Mount. Then on the eastern ridge, that is the city of David. The main reasons for this proposal: 1, the city of David Ridge does not have a silhouette of a tail. 2, most periods are not represented in the city of David Ridge, or represented by only a scatter of pottery near the spring, restricted to the spring. 3, periods with clear textual evidence for habitation in Jerusalem, such as the late Bronze, are not represented here. 4, unlike most sites in the highlands, the city of David Ridge is located in a compromising topography situation. 5, there is no fortification on the western side of the city of David Ridge. We argued that the Mount of the Temple Mount was the core of ancient Jerusalem, from where the city expanded in times of prosperity and to which it contracted in times of crisis. According to our calculation, there is enough space there for a significant distance between the slopes and the walls of the Herodian Temple Mount platform. For political and religious sensitivities, this theory, which resolves many of the problems related to the settlement history of Jerusalem, cannot be tested in the field. This is an optimal situation, as you can understand, for us. In fact, considering the large-scale Herodian work on the Temple Mount, which included leveling and filling operations, I doubt very much if much of the early remains have survived. Accordingly, I now propose that the Persian and early Hellenistic settlement was located on the original mound on the Temple Mount. Still, this settlement was probably poor and limited in size and population. The sifting operation of debris taken a few years ago from the southern part of the Temple Mount recovered almost no Persian period finds, compared to a significant number of finds from the Iron II and from the late Hellenistic and early Roman periods. The same is true for Eilat Mazar's excavations in the Ophel, immediately Ophel also, the modern terminology, to the southeast of Al-Aqsa Mosque, and to pottery collected in other surroundings around other locations around the Temple Mount. So this leads me to the question of the famous question, or infamous, of the Nehemiah wall. Archaeologists accepted a description of the construction of Jerusalem's city wall in Nehemiah 3 as portraying an historical reality in the Persian period, and argued only on the cost of the fortification. The minimalists restricted it to the city of David Ridge, while the maximalists proposed that the wall also encircle the southwestern hill. Two finds in the field were perceived as representing Nehemiah's city wall, one on the crest of the city of David Ridge above the Gihon Spring in the east, and the other on the western side of the ridge. In the east, Catlin Canyon, identified a short segment in the fortification that had first been uncovered by McAllister and Duncan as the city wall built by Nehemiah. She based this date on pottery found in a layer dumped against the outer face of the wall. Shiloh too argued that the Nehemiah city wall was built, and I quote, on the bedrock at the top of the eastern slope, unquote. This idea has recently been revived by Eilat Mazar based on finds retrieved under the fortification of the foundations of the wall, which date to the end of the 6th and the first half of the 5th century BC. Yet pottery in debris thrown against the outer face of a fortification can hardly be used in order to date it, as it could have been taken from a dump on the slope or any other place and put there in later times in order to support the wall. And the finds described by Eilat Mazar provide no more than a terminus post quem, or the construction of the tower, later than the late 6th and early 5th century BCE. The obvious date for the city wall uncovered above the eastern slope is the late Hellenistic, Hasmonean period, as suggested by many authorities. Please note that the excavations immediately to the west of this place did not, I repeat, did not spot architectural remains from the Persian and early Hellenistic periods. The only piece of information from the western side of the city of David Ridge comes from Crowfoot's 1927 excavations. A massive structure that had been founded on bedrock was unearthed under thick layers of later occupation remains. It was described as a Bronze Age gatehouse that continued to be in use until Roman times. Albright identified it with the Dan gate of Nehemiah 3, verse 13, while Albrecht Alt proposed equating it with the Valley Gate mentioned in the same verse. Yet David Yosishkin rightly questioned the identification of the structure as a gate, and convincingly argued that the remains probably date to the late Hellenistic or early Roman periods. This feats results in recent work to the south of this spot, so this is confirmed, I suppose. To sum up this issue, there is no archaeological evidence for the city wall of Nehemiah. Theoretically, one could argue that Nehemiah merely built the ruined late Iron II wall. Yet, in the many sections of this fortification that have been uncovered on both the southwestern hill in the picture and the southeastern ridge, there is no clue for renovation or reconstruction in the Persian period. In the parts of the late Iron II city wall uncovered on the southwestern hill, the change an addition date to the late Hellenistic period. Moreover, 3 city walls are known along one slope, dating to the Middle Bronze, the late Iron II, and the Hellenistic period. All 3 were easy to trace and were found relatively well preserved. No other city wall has ever been found. Had it not been for the Nehemiah 3 account, no researcher would have argued for a Persian period city wall on the city of David Ridge. One could suggest that the description of the wall in Nehemiah 3 refers to a reconstruction of the iron two fortifications of the mound on the Temple Mount. Yet the listing of many towers and gates does not fit the limited circumference of the old mound. It must refer to bigger, so to speak, Jerusalem of either the Iron II or the late Hellenistic period. It is broadly agreed upon that Nehemiah 3 is not part of the Nehemiah memoir. Indeed, as far as I can judge, this chapter should be read on the background of the construction of the Hasmonean city wall. I have dealt with this issue elsewhere, and there is no need to elaborate here. The Nehemiah memoir refers to the poor state of the fortification of Jerusalem. This may relate to the ruined Iron Age city wall, but also note that recent works on the book of Nehemiah raise the possibility that the memoir too should be read on a Hasmonean era background. This leads me to a short discussion of the province of Yehud. The territorial extent of Persian period Yehud and estimate of its population are equally important to our discussion. They too have far-reaching implications for the affiliation of a large number of biblical compositions to this place and era. Recent research by Lipschitz and van der Hooft on the Yehud seal impressions and my own work on the geographical lists in the books of Ezra, Nehemiah, and Chronicles call for a fresh treatment of both issues. The borders of the province of Yehud have ostensibly been reconstructed according to the geographical lists in the books of Ezra and Nehemiah, first and foremost among them the list of the builders of Jerusalem's city wall in Nehemiah 3, and of course the distribution of the Persian period Yehud seal impressions. In fact, the main factor has been the biblical text. Considering the problem of dating the reality behind Nehemiah 3, and with no extra biblical textual data for the Persian period, in Jerusalem, one should try to reconstruct the border of Yehud only according to the distribution of the Persian period celebrations. Groups 1 to 12 in Lipschitz and van der Hooft. Perhaps also with the fragmentary textual data on the 3rd and 2nd centuries BC. Accordingly, Yehud seems to have included mainly the area of Jerusalem between Rabat Rachel and the city of David. It could have been slightly farther to the south, but Betzur seems to have been outside the province. In the north, the dearth of early seal impressions from the area of Mitzpah and Nebi Samuel raises the question whether this area was included in Yehud. The list of returnees, which mentions places in this area, should probably be read on late Hellenistic Hasmonean background, and I don't have time to go into this now. In the east, there was a possible extension to Jericho and En-Gedi. As for the west, in the time of the Zedon papyri of the mid-3rd century BC, Maresha and Adoraim belonged to Idumea. According to 1 Maccabees, the area of Lod and Gezer, as well as Ekron in the western Shephelah, were annexed to Judea only in the days of Jonathan and Simon and Jonathan, in the 40s of the 2nd century. As I have already suggested, Yehud was ruled from a small temple village in Jerusalem, which was located on a Temple Mount and which had a limited population. Still, its status as the capital of the province, we have to admit, is clear from the Elephantine papyrus, from the seal impressions, and seemingly also from the high level of silver in the Yehud coins, which seems to be related to the role in the temple economy. Based on the interpretation of the literary sources, the population of Persian period Yehud had been estimated to have numbered up to 150,000 souls. More reasonable archaeology-based studies have estimated the population of the province to have been between 20 and 30,000 people. Yet the latter numbers too, seem to be somewhat inflated. Scholars use too big density coefficient, that is to say people per built-up hectare, too big estimate for the population of Jerusalem, that is not realistic archaeologically, and too big estimate for the extension of Yehud. My own figures, I repeat, my own figures are based on scrutiny of the archaeological data per site, yet limiting it to the area from north of Bet Sur to Mitzpah and from the Dead Sea to the border between the highlands and the Shephelah. As far as I can judge, and you can see on the screen, the total built-up area in Yehud can be estimated at around 60 hectares. Deploying a density coefficient of about 200 people per one built-up hectare, the population of the entire province of Yehud in the Persian period, including Jerusalem, would be about 12,000 people, comparable to the population of Jerusalem alone in the late Iron II and the late Hellenistic period. This comes to about 15% only of the population of the highlands part of Iron II, B, and C, Judah. These demographic estimates work against scholars who tend to belittle the scope of the catastrophe which befell Judah in 586 BC. At the same time, they contradict the notion of massive waves of returnees to Yehud. They also seem to lessen the importance of the population of Yehud relative to the elite deportees in Babylonia, in the production of exilic and post-exilic biblical texts, and in shaping the nature of early post-exilic Judaism. Material culture. So let's turn to material culture. The demographic deterioration which I have just described and the poor state of the population of Yehud find expression in two items of material culture. First, the disappearance of elaborate rock-cut burials, especially in Jerusalem, but also in the countryside of Judah. This indicates that compared to the Iron II C, the elite groups shrank dramatically. Second is the evidence for scribal activity, probably more important even. So, strong scribal activity in late monarchic Judah is demonstrated by the corpora of Ostraka from Arad, Lachish, Chovat Uzzah, Malchata, and Kadesh Barnea, and other places. The spread of literacy is also attested in the proliferation of inscribed seals and seal impressions. The most striking evidence for dissemination of literacy in Judah comes from the work of the digital epigraphy team at Tel Aviv University, which has been directed by Eli Pisetsky and me. Algorithmic-based comparison of handwriting identified 5 authors in 16 Arad Ostraka with enough data for analysis, representing the entire echelon of the Judahite military system, down to the assistant quartermaster of the fort. Now, forensic examination by the retired chief handwriting expert of Israel's police extended the number of authors in this 16 Ostraka even further. This shows that the recognition of the power of writing spread in the Judahite administration far beyond temple and palace. Late monarchic Judah became what I can describe, all of us can describe, I suppose, as writing society. This was probably an outcome of the century when Judah was dominated by Assyria and was incorporated into the sphere of Assyrian global economy, administration, and culture. This impressive evidence for scribal infrastructure in Judah disappeared, I repeat, disappeared after 586 BC destruction. In the Babylonian and Persian period, the southern highlands show almost no evidence of Hebrew, underline Hebrew, inscriptions. In fact, the only meager evidence comes from a few letters on Yehud, on few Yehud coins, which date to the 4th century. And coins can hardly attest, in my opinion, to genuine scribal activity, dissemination of scribal activity. This means that not a single Hebrew inscription is known for the period between 586 and 350, not an ostrakon, nor a seal, not a seal impression, nor a bulla. In short, there is no evidence for Hebrew writing culture in Yehud. One could argue for production of literary works on papyri in the temple. I'm bringing this picture only as an example. This is possible, of course, though I find it extremely difficult that nothing of this activity leaked to other media of writing. I'm not suggesting here that the knowledge of writing Hebrew disappeared altogether, because such a statement would contradict the revival of Hebrew in the second century Hasmonean state. But scribal activity declined dramatically. This should come as no surprise. The destruction of Judah brought about the collapse of the kingdom's bureaucracy and deportation of many of the educated intelligentsia, the literati. The vine dressers and ploughsmen who remained in the land, to use the biblical expression, were hardly capable of producing written documents. Excursus Bethel. Before I close, I wish to briefly refer to Bethel, a site outside the territory of Yehud. Its temple has been mentioned in scholarly discussion as a repository, quote unquote, of biblical texts, mainly northern ones, in the Babylonian and Persian period. And I referred, for instance, to a very important article by Knauf. A few years ago, Lili Zinger-Ravitz and I revisited the finds retrieved from the site, both in the published reports and unpublished in storage in Jerusalem and in Pittsburgh. The results of our investigation, we actually went to Pittsburgh to look at the pottery. The results of our investigation indicated that the settlement history of the site was not continuous, as held by the excavators, based on uncritical reading of the biblical text by the excavators. Rather, it was characterized by oscillations, with 3 phases of strong activity in the Iron 1, Iron 2B, and Hellenistic periods, 2 periods of decline in the late Iron 2A and the Iron 2C, and 2 periods of probable abandonment in the early Iron 2A, and most significantly, in the Babylonian and Persian period. This evidence cannot be brushed aside as stemming from deficiencies in the excavations, as significant sectors of the small mound, bigger than can be suggested at first glance, had been excavated. They did not yield Persian period finds. So, the meaning of this. The data presented here, the archaeology of Jerusalem, the settlement and demographic situation in Yehud, and the poor evidence for scribal activity, cast doubt on the notion of major activity of composition of biblical texts in Jerusalem in the Persian period. My humble advice is twofold. First, to try date as much material as possible to periods in Judea that demonstrate widespread scribal activity and literacy in all media and all forms of inscriptions. That is, the later phases of the Iron Age and the late Hellenistic period after 200 BC, perhaps even later slightly. For lack of time, I refrain from dealing with this question in detail. My second advice is that for the era between 600 and 200 BC, 586 and 200, especially the Babylonian and Persian periods, to place the compilation of as much material as possible in Babylonia and in Egypt. This has recently been advocated by Thomas Romer, my friend, in the footsteps of Alberts and others. Of course, I accept that there must have been some continuity in production of literary works in Yehud. One can imagine, for instance, a secluded, educated priestly group near the temple. But even this is not an elegant solution, as I mentioned before, would have expected something from this scribal activity to leak to daily life, and nothing did. In short, I too am tantalized by this fact and can only urge scholars not to ignore the archaeological evidence, despite the fact that at times it is mainly negative, and even if it threatens to shatter Fed-driven theories. And what about Yahwism under the Achaemenid Empire? As I said in the beginning of my talk, with evidence coming mostly, if not solely, from biblical texts, mostly, and with no clue from archaeology, I would only advise to be exceedingly cautious in addressing this theme too. Thank you very much for attending and listening to this lecture.
Can you hear this?
Yes, we can hear. I can hear.
You can?
Yes, I do.
Thank you for intriguing lecture, and I'll open the floor for questions. Do you hear them?
Yes, yes, I can hear you at least. I hope that I will be able to hear everybody.
Israel Shalom, can you hear me?
Yes, I do. I can.
Hi, it's Ohad from Haifa University.
Hi, Ohad.
Few notes of linguistics. I think evidence from silence should be, at least from the linguistics perspective, should be treated very carefully. What we see in the Persian period, we see a lot of Aramaic, which is the administrative language. We can see it. It depends on the corpora. What we find are economics and other kind of stuff, which is written in the linguistic administrative stratum. What we have in literature is the books from the Bible, which are under question mark. So we exclude them. But we have to be very careful. Yesterday I lectured about the importance of the personal names. According to the personal names that we find in the Ostraka, in the Aramaic Ostraka, which I believe represent the oral stratum, Judean is a vivid phenomena, completely. We can show that in many linguistic features. I do believe that if we go back to the biblical text themselves, from Ezra and Nehemiah and Chronicles, today, once we understand that Phoenician and the Canaanite melting pot is that Nehemiah is telling us about is a vivid feature, we can go back to these texts and see that there are a lot of linguistic features that are coming from these melting pot of Canaanite dialect, which I do believe is a living feature of the era. So the silence is mainly because of the genre that we find and the fact that we exclude literature. But by checking the personal names, we can feel that this is a vivid phenomenon.
Reaction?
No, I accept what Ohad says. I have my reservations. I'm not a linguist, as you know, and Ohad knows this far better than me. But I have some reservations regarding the evidence for Aramaic, because most of what we have, other than the administrative in the still impressions, of course, which come from archaeology, from excavations, I have an issue with the large number of inscriptions that come from the market. But I don't want to open this here because it will take us to endless discussion. Anyway, thank you, Ohad, for your observations. Of course, they need to be taken into consideration.
Other questions? I have one. What do you make of biblical manuscript from Qumran, very ancient, dated to the 3rd century BCE?
Yes, to the 3rd century, definitely. Perhaps to the late 3rd century. I am not a Qumran expert, and I am trying to follow the dating, the logic behind the dating of the Qumran manuscripts, the Qumran material. Yes, when we get close to 200 BC, of course, everything is possible. Please remember that we also have Ben Sira, the Apocrypha, from probably the beginning of the century.
Absolutely, yeah. Or Tobit. Well, thank you very much. All the questions disappeared. Maybe you have convinced everybody. Thank you.
I'm not sure.